Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to the next lecture on clauses. In this lecture we'll be talking about clauses and independent clauses, dependent clauses. So without wasting time, let's come to the independent clauses first, and we'll be analyzing this sentence for independent clause. To understand the independent clause, we'll be analyzing the single sentence, that is, night came on and it rained heavily. So if I ask the same question which I asked in the previous lecture, like what is this inside the big brown rectangle? Is it a sentence or clause or clauses? Your answer must be the same as it is sentence, because as we have used here only one full stop, which is one of the identifications of the sentence, and this sentence has got this part and this part, two parts. So which means night came on is one of the part of the sentence and it rained heavily is the other part of this sentence. So whatever is inside the big brown rectangle is sentence, and whatever is inside the blue rectangles is clause. So both of these parts are known as clauses. Now our point is, our topic is, what is independent clause. So as we have said, in the big brown rectangle, whatever is inside the big brown rectangle is sentence, and in this case we have these two parts in the big brown circle. Inside the big brown circle, they are night came on and it rained heavily, and both of these have been joined with and. So let's see what happens when we separate these parts from the sentence. Do they give complete meaning, or if any confusion remains behind or any question arises? Let's see. Night came on. Is there any confusion with the sentence or with the part, with this clause? If there is no confusion, it means this part can stand as a sentence, or we can call it sentence when we separate from the sentence. And the next part, it rained heavily. Is there any confusion with the sentence or any question arises here? If there is no question, no confusion remains behind, it means this part can also stand on its own if we separate from the sentence. So it means when a part of the sentence, which we call a clause, can stand on its own, we call it a, an independent clause. So I hope now you have understood the definition of an independent clause. What is an independent clause? Let's see for your confirmation. Clause that can stand by itself and still make sense. The same thing, when we separate the clause from the sentence, it can stand as a sentence, or it can give its complete meaning without any confusion. An independent clause could be its own sentence, the same thing, but is often part of a larger structure combined with other independent clauses and with dependent clauses. So sometimes we join dependent clauses together, and sometimes we join dependent clauses with independent clauses, or independent clauses with dependent clauses. So how do we join? When we join only dependent clauses, we use coordinating conjunctions. These will be discussed in detail when we will be discussing the kinds of sentences. So to keep the coordinating conjunctions in your mind, remember this mnemonic. This is a kind of acronym, or we call it mnemonic fanboys. So here F stands for, A stands for and, N stands for nor, B stands for but, O stands for or, Y stands for yet, and S stands for So these are the coordinating conjunctions. We'll be discussing in the type of or kinds of sentences in detail. So let's come to the dependent clauses. What are dependent clauses? Let's take the example sentence. We got wet when it rained heavily. So this is the sentence, means this is inside the big brown rectangle. So we already we have said that whatever is inside the big brown rectangle is sentence. So what we have inside the big brown rectangle here, we got wet when it rained. So again the same thing, these two parts which are inside the blue rectangles are parts of this big brown rectangle, means in other words they are clauses. So let's see, when we separate these parts or these clauses from the sentence, what happens? Is there any confusion, or they give their meaning completely, there is no question, or is there any question? Let's see. We got wet. Is there any confusion? If there is no confusion, we can say this is not a dependent clause. It is independent clause. If there is a confusion, or if there is any question, arises there, you can say this is not an independent clause. It depends. Does it depend on this part? And let's separate this part from the sentence. When it rained heavily. Is there any confusion? Yes, it demands for the further clarification. When it rained, what happened? The question arises, what was there? Where were you? So different confusions arise here. When it rained, what happened? So this part depends on this part. We got wet. When it rained heavily, what happened? The answer for what happened is we got wet. So it means this part depends upon this part. That's why we got wet is an independent clause, because it does not depend on this one. It can stand as a sentence on its own, and this part does not stand on its own, rather it depends for its clear meaning or clarification on the first part. That's why we call it uh, dependent clause. So when we join dependent clauses with independent clauses, we use subordinating conjunctions. So here I think you must have a confusion. When we had an example for independent clauses, and both were we joined two independent clauses and we were separating the conjunction from the clause, but here we are not separating the conjunction when from the clause. So why do we do it? If you want to know the answer of this question, you will have to ask me through WhatsApp, or you can call me. We'll discuss the question. So when we join the dependent clauses with independent clause, what do we use? We use subordinating conjunctions. And what are subordinating conjunctions? Okay, let's come to the definition first. What is dependent clause? A clause that cannot stand by itself, means it depends on the other part of the sentence to give its complete meaning or to clear the meaning. It depends on something else, and an independent clause for its meaning. Usually it depends on the independent clause to complete its meaning. A dependent clause trying to stand on its own, or if we write a dependent clause separately as a sentence, it will be known as sentence fragment, which is known as sentence fault. It will be called sentence fragment. If you are writing a dependent clause as a sentence, it will be not a sentence, it will be sentence fragment. And subordinating conjunctions, to remember subordinating conjunction, keep this in your mind. This is mnemonic uswa bit. So U stands for unless or until, S stands for since, W stands for when or while, A stands for after, B stands for before or because, I stands for if, and T stands for therefore. So these are subordinating conjunctions. We'll be discussing subordinating conjunctions and coordinating conjunctions in type of sentences in detail. So that's all for today. We'll see you in the next lecture. So till then, take care.